Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. Kim Yojong, the younger sister of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, threatened to use nuclear weapons on South Korea. This was the first time the North Korean regime issued a public threat that it could attack South Korea with nuclear arsenals. The threat came as South Korea prepares for the transition to the incoming administration of President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Evans Revere, non-resident senior fellow at Brookings Institution. Mr. Revere served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Scott Snyder is also with me today. Mr. Snyder is Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the show. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you for the invitation.
North Korea has always claimed they are developing nuclear weapons for self-defense. But when you hear something like what Kim Yojong said, this is threatening, isn't it, Mr. Revere?
I think it's always important that we take threats that we receive from North Korea very seriously, especially when they're delivered by somebody at the rank of Kim Yo-jong. But particularly since in her statements in recent days, she provided us some very valuable strategic clarity regarding North Korea's intentions in two critical areas. First of all, many of my Korean friends over the years, friends and colleagues, have always said that they didn't think North Korea would ever use nuclear weapons against fellow Koreans. Well, she has now made it very clear that North Korea would certainly be prepared to use its nuclear arsenal against South Korea. But the other thing that she did, a very valuable thing that she has done for us, is that we've now learned that for the North Koreans, nuclear weapons are not just an insurance policy, a way to guarantee the continued survival of the regime, but they are also an important tool to try to intimidate South Korea, or as somebody might say, to tame South Korea. And those are two very important things that we learned from Kim Yo-jong in recent days.
Mr. Snyder, what did you make of remark from Kim Yo-jong?
Well, I agree with Evans that anytime Kim Yo-jong, a statement is issued in the name of Kim Yo-jong, it draws a lot of attention and importance. But another feature of her statements, I think, that has been that they have been much more coarse and even undiplomatic. And so as I look at Kim Yo-jong's statements in relation to the normal official releases from the DPRK, it almost makes me feel like Kim Yo-jong is conveying a feeling, or she's tweeting, versus reading the final judgment that might be more authoritatively delivered through an editorial process like that in the New York Times.
Actually, it was interesting that Kim Yo-jong released the two statements in 2 days. Mr. Revere, what did you think about that?
The first statement was generally very predictable. Whenever the North Koreans feel that they have been threatened, they always respond, and they respond bluntly. There's no filter. They say some very over-the-top and sometimes brutal things. But there's a formula that the North Koreans often follow when they do this. And the formula is, if the other party does A, we will do B. Her first statement didn't follow that formula. She broke the rules. And I think in that context, it's interesting to look at the second statement, because the second statement made very clear that whatever North Korea planned to do, in this case, use nuclear weapons, it would only be in response to something that the South Koreans did. So that's the formula. So I looked at the second statement and I thought it resembled a correction, if you will, or clarification, getting the North Korean rhetoric back on the normal track. Which is to make a threat, but only to make a threat in the context of an action that the other party would take. So I think she may have had a long chat with her brother to talk about what the proper formula would be so that they could stay on what they regard as the high ground.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, do you think Kim Yo-jong is continuing her role as a bad cop in the North Korean regime?
Well, certainly there's a quality to that, to those statements. But I want to go back and look at those statements, also because I agree with Evans that the issuance of these two statements in such a short period of time is quite striking and revealing. And the other aspect of the first statement that I thought was interesting is that it suggested that the North Koreans might use nuclear weapons in response to words rather than actions. And the second statement reaffirmed that North Korea is viewing the nuclear capability as a response mechanism. But at the same time, it's very clear that having nuclear weapons is not providing the North Koreans with the cloak of invulnerability that they thought it would. And I think that's the reason why they're responding so viscerally to this dialogue about preemptive strike in the way that they phrased it, preemptive strike against a nuclear state, as though South Korea is having the audacity to challenge a nuclear North Korea. And so that is going to be very interesting to watch, I think, going forward, because it plays into where North Korea thinks it wants to be in the hierarchy with South Korea versus maybe where South Korea also is projecting itself in terms of a capacity to manage North Korea's nuclear threat.
Mm-hmm. As Mr. Snyder said, Kim Yo-jong's statements were released as a reaction to what South Korean Defense Minister Seok said. He said South Korea will be able to strike North Korea's missile launch points if and when North Korea missile attack is imminent. Mr. Revere, why do you think Kim Yo-jong or the North Korean regime reacted what the South Korean defense minister said, and why say anything about the nuclear attack?
I think the North Koreans had to react. In their system, they go through life with a chip on their shoulder. And whenever they feel threatened, whenever there is any rhetoric that they believe offends their leader or their system, or in this case, their military activities, they're compelled to respond. This is a requirement, I think, in their system. It would have been very unusual for them to have said nothing, quite frankly, especially since the ROK defense minister was talking about a preemptive strike on the North. What I found interesting is that it was not the defense minister who was the first one to make reference to this, obviously. It was the president-elect who said something very similar recently. And I think this message was as much intended for the incoming ROK president as it was for the current ROK administration in the Blue House right now.
Mr. Snyder, how do you see the likelihood of North Korea actually using nuclear weapons on South Korea?
Well, I think the clarification is useful in that regard because I think that North Korea continues to be aware that there's a difference between threat and use, and that actual use of nuclear weapons would bring about overwhelming consequences that are contrary to North Korea's and Kim Jong-un's goals of regime survival. So I think that's an important distinction, but it is disturbing to see that North Korea, in its broader military planning, does intend to incorporate nuclear weapons as part of a tactical response in the event of a military conflict. And so we need to watch this. I do believe that North Korea continues to be deterred from nuclear use, but the trend line in terms of really the fact that their overall conventional weakness means that the only tool they have in the toolbox for responding to any kind of perceived provocation actually is the nuclear threat. That's a problem, and it should be concerning to us.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Revere, your thought?
I would agree with Scott on all the points that he made. It is troubling, and this goes back to the second point of strategic clarity that Kim Yo-jong provided us. that they actually do envision scenarios in which they would use nuclear weapons. And that is something that we ought to be concerned about. And it makes the steps that we take as allies with our South Korean friends all the more important to make sure that there is no question in the minds of the North Koreans about what our intentions are in the event of a nuclear use on the Korean Peninsula.
Mm-hmm. Then, Mr. Revere, what is the right response the U.S. can take at a time like this?
Well, I think we need to step back and remember that the path that North Korea is on right now was very clearly defined by Kim Jong-un over a year ago, in which he laid out the various technologies and systems and nuclear and ballistic missile and other capabilities that North Korea is developing. And he is following that path almost to the letter, if you will. I think it's incumbent on the United States and the ROK to work very closely together to ensure that we continue to raise the price that the North Korean regime pays, both currently and in the future, for the steps that it is taking. I think we need to resume larger scale military exercises. I think that we ought to very seriously consider moving certain assets around the Korean Peninsula on a more frequent basis. The recent visit by an SSBM, a ballistic missile submarine, to Guam was, I think, an important step. The fact that it was so visible to the North Koreans. The idea of a carrier battle group occasionally paying a visit to the Korean Peninsula, as one did recently. That's the sort of thing that we ought to be doing, and we ought to make sure that the North Koreans, as well as the Chinese, are aware that there is a price to be paid for the actions that North Korea is taking, and that we are going to not only maintain our deterrent, but to enhance it.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, obviously North Korea is not responding to U.S. overtures. What can the U.S. do more?
Well, in terms of the immediate response, Evans has noted a few things that the U.S. is doing. I would just note also that Ambassador Sung Kim, over the course of the last few days, actually made a statement that made the North Korean statements also about the United States. Kim Yo-jong's statements were really directed at South Korea, and the U.S. has indicated that this sort of threat will draw a combined alliance response. And also, it's really a matter of coordinating and, frankly, I think preparing for the inevitable crisis that is to come with North Korea, really before it's likely that we're going to be able to get to the negotiating table. Despite all of Sung Kim's offers and availability for negotiation, I think we have to manage the crisis and try to shape the outcome of that before it's likely we're going to get to talks with North Korea. And so we need to be cognizant of that and planning very carefully in order to achieve our desired objective with South Korea.
Mm-hmm. South Korean President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol's transition team was visiting Washington this week. I'm sure they had a lot of discussion about North Korea while meeting officials here. Mr. Snyder, what should the Yoon administration do as soon as they start working?
Well, as you just suggested, I think they're already doing it. They've begun consultation with the U.S. It's important that move forward as expeditiously as possible in order to ensure a combined approach to North Korea, especially in the face of a likely early test of the new leadership of President-elect Yoon. And this was just one visit, but I think that we're going to have to engage in a fairly intensive series of consultations in the coming weeks and months in order to fully prepare.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Revere, what does Yoon Suk-yeol's team need to make sure when they start dealing with North Korea officially?
Well, I think the initial steps that they've taken so far, the rhetorical steps that they've taken, are important. They're laying down certain markers already with North Korea, especially the most important marker of all, which is to maintain solidarity with the Republic of Korea's American ally. That's an important step, and the fact that there are these consultations that have been going on in Washington between the president-elect's team and a whole range of officials in Washington. That's an important symbolism. But beyond that, I think it's going to be extremely important for Seoul and Washington to try to stay in lockstep as things go forward. There's a lot of work to be done, a lot of heavy lifting to be done as we try to very carefully raise the price to North Korea of its actions, as we strengthen our deterrent, and as we take other actions to make it very clear to Pyongyang, but as I said earlier, also to Beijing, that we're very serious about defending our ally and working very closely and cooperatively with our South Korean ally and others in the region in response to North Korea.
It is widely suspected that North Korea could further provoke either test another missile or nuclear weapon on April 15th, celebrating the anniversary of Kim Il-sung's 110th birthday. What's your guess about this, Mr. Revere?
Well, I'd only be guessing. I'm not going to guess about dates or anything like that. The dates are selected by the North Koreans for political reasons and to send political messages. The more important date is the date that the scientists and the technicians will tell the leader that they're ready to move forward with either an ICBM test or a nuclear test or both. And we just don't know that. We do know that they're making progress. We do know that they're making preparations. We do know that they have said that they're going down this path, and I have no reason not to believe the North Koreans. When that happens is an internal decision from the North Koreans, but we will have to prepare ourselves for what I think is the inevitability of further steps in the missile area and the nuclear area by the North Koreans.
Mr. Snyder, do you predict something would happen around the April 15th?
Well, I try never to make predictions about what North Korea is going to do, but I would simply point to what you suggested in the earlier question, and that is that North Korea also has a domestic rationale for engaging in what they probably more likely feel are demonstrations of their power rather than provocations. And there is a need as part of Kim Jong-un's broader need to ensure political loyalty within North Korea to try to demonstrate, to do demonstrations of power. And unfortunately, in the case of some of the actions that might be contemplated, they are on a trajectory that will raise tensions and will bring an external response, even if there is an accompanying internal motivation for pursuing some of those demonstrations.
Well, this week, Sung Kim, U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, had a busy week in Washington, meeting his South Korean counterpart and also his Chinese counterpart, respectively. His meeting with China's Liu Xiaoming was especially noteworthy. Mr. Snyder, do you think we might start to see some kind of cooperation between the two countries?
Well, I'd like to see some measure of cooperation between the U.S. and China. In the current environment of rising rivalry between the U.S. and China, it is particularly difficult to imagine that cooperation, and therefore particularly notable that our chief North Korea representatives in Washington and Beijing were engaging in consultation with each other. But to be honest, I think there's going to have to be a lot more and higher level effort to compartmentalize the issue of North Korea in the U.S.-China relationship as a prerequisite to being able to manage the issue effectively, including a public identification of North Korea by President Biden and Xi Jinping, that this is an area that is going to be separated from the broader contest between the U.S. and China.
Mr. Revere, what's your thought? Like Li Xiaoming flying all the way to Washington to meet Sung Kim and other officials, isn't this a positive sign?
Well, Scott made a number of very, very important points, and I would only add to that I personally am rather skeptical. It's certainly a good thing that the U.S. and PRC senior officials are meeting to discuss North Korea. That hasn't happened in a while, and it's good that it happened. But quite frankly, the Chinese are probably feeling a bit of heat because if anything, the role of China, together with Russia recently in the UN Security Council, for example, has been the role of obstructionists, preventing a consensus from being formed in response to North Korea's very clear violation of UN Security Council resolutions. And so I think part of the PRC representative's presence in Washington perhaps was aimed at taking a bit of the heat off Beijing for its lack of cooperation. And at the same time, since we have both the Russians and the Chinese acting as enablers and looking the other way as North Korea continues to violate UN Security Council resolutions, as it continues to develop its ballistic missile and nuclear weapons capabilities, I think the Chinese are trying to send signals that they are not ignoring the problem. And perhaps that's a good thing, but I still have some questions about Chinese seriousness and sincerity. So pardon my skepticism.
Mm-hmm. This is my last question for today. So apparently North Korea is not interested in talking with United States right now. What can be done about this?
At the end of the day, the only conversation that North Korea is interested in having, to be very frank, is a conversation that leads to ultimately the acceptance of the DPRK as a de facto nuclear weapon state. I think North Korea knows that we're never going to formally acknowledge them as such, but I think they're looking for a dialogue in which we sit down with them as one nuclear weapon state with another, which is what their foreign minister told me and a group of other Americans in New York about 12 years ago. That was their goal, he said. And so my sense is that the North Koreans want to have that conversation, and they want to have a conversation about the removal of sanctions. They're not quite ready to have those conversations yet. And I think part of their game plan is to continue to turn up the heat via nuclear tests and ballistic missile tests to provide the proper atmosphere from their perspective for such a dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder?
Well, I agree absolutely that North Korea's objective is to be affirmed internationally as a nuclear state, and that is the central sticking point as regards resuming any kind of negotiations, since the Biden administration has made it clear that the purpose of negotiations is about North Korea's denuclearization. But I also want to step back and suggest that, as North Korea pursues this objective of being recognized as a nuclear state, it has very adeptly used political transition periods in the U.S. And South Korea in order to, in some ways, throw the game board over and then try to reset in a position that enhances their accomplishments. And so we need to guard against that, especially at this time of transition, and simply be aware that it is important for us to have a dialogue with North Korea, but the difficulty of addressing the core issue of difference between the U.S. and North Korea remains a pretty yawning gap between the two sides.
Satellite imagery showed North Korea is indeed preparing for a military parade ahead of the big event slated for April 15th. A huge red card section was clearly visible, showing the word unity being displayed. What will North Korea show this time, and will it surprise us? We have one more week to find out. Mr. Revere and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.